Ready?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm Clayton, and Rebecca's with me,
Hey.
and we have Raz with us, so there may be some snoring. If there's snoring or whining, it's from the dog. So, yeah, how did I start woodworking, or how did I start doing it as a business? 2000. So this picture is from 2017. It's I think one of the first big purchases that I made of a giant slab of wood from a local guy, local to where I grew up in Lewiston, Illinois. And I chose this path because wood is a medium that has always held interest to me, but specifically the possibilities that you have with creating in wood are hard to match. It's accessible for most people. Pretty much anyone can go out and buy some wood and start on some sort of project and then take it literally as far as you could want from a craftsmanship or an artisan's level. So that's why I was attracted to using wood as my medium for hopefully starting a business that delivered a product from imagination all the way to a hopefully useful product, which I like both of those elements of woodworking. And yeah, started that in 2017 and did the business. Started Mason Furniture Studio, where I made many different types of furniture and also other types of like little home goods like serving trays and that sort of thing. And yeah, really enjoyed doing that and having my own thing. I did go back to the traditional workforce a few years ago, and still did woodworking part time, but I did exclusively woodworking for about 2 years. Is there any other Mason Furniture Studio history that someone would want to know?
I was just gonna talk about the history component in the wood that you use because it's local wood. It obviously takes a long time for trees to reach a size where you can get these large slabs that make it possible to build really full slab type of furniture.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I think is really cool about all of this is the fact that there's this tie from the finished product, the furniture, all the way back to, maybe 100 years even when the tree was a seedling. And I think that that's relevant for this project too.
Yeah, that is another one of the main reasons was to engage in sort of the history of the wood because it's a living thing, and not all of, but most of the wood that I use, especially in big projects, are from some of it you'll see later are things I harvested myself, or they're from somebody who I went to high school with. They're from people's yards and from townships and parks, and they lived a whole life and had a whole story before they ever became repurposed as something that was also beautiful. And trying to capture and do justice to like the little pieces that a lot of history has been tied up in, like that this giant piece that I'm holding held history in it because it showed, once you cut it into cross sections, you could see that it had been burned. So it had been in some sort of giant fire, and that fire was 25 years ago. And the piece next to that had a bullet embedded in it from 30 plus years ago, and just kind of grew around it. And those things pop out, and it is a snapshot of a time and place in every single one of these pieces. And I was constantly surprised by the sorts of things that I found, or the stories that we're told every piece of wood has rays and grains and sorts of things that aren't revealed until you start to actually work with it. And those are all part of that tree's story. And yeah, I do find that super interesting. And I found the people that I worked with in the woodworking community also and equally and like hugely generous people, and shared all of their time and little insights with me. So yeah. So yeah, 2017. So later in the year in 2017, we did date this. I did a site visit with Helen and Dick to check out their space where they were maybe thinking about commissioning some furniture, and I took some direct inspiration from that space and checked out their bonsai collection and their method for training some of it, and also looked at what furniture they already had and kind of the space where things were going to live. And so this piece caught my eye, and I liked the color, and I liked the glass, and I liked how it was super functional for them, and looked very nice doing it. And a bit blurry, but this is the home that we were kind of hoping to make something for, and have a place that have a place for the bonsai that also fit this sort of space in their home. So I was extremely interested in doing the project, so I went back and went to the drawing board and drew up some extremely rough drafts, just scale model of what the rough idea would be, so I could kind of propose something back to Helen and Dick, and they could take a look at what I was thinking for that space. So I went with an asymmetrical design, and they kind of fit well into that space, and hopefully provided enough space also to fit some okay sized bonsai trees or other plants. And I did want to continue with the glass, and that was something that they specified as a client as well. So I drew up some original glass frames and called local glass company to see if they could do that. They had made glass for some of my projects before, so I chose them. And from there, wanted to be able to provide a bit more of what my vision was. So I created a model of this piece of furniture in SketchUp. So did a 3D model where you can completely sort of spin the piece. You can also put all measurements in, and the timeline that this project fell into was much longer than I or anyone else originally anticipated. So it was awesome to be able to jump back in here and see what was I thinking at the time. You kind of go through a ton of work to make sure that you do everything in a proportionally nice way so that everything looks good when you're done. And it was extremely beneficial for me to be able to pop back out to this and pull measurements off of a design that hopefully if it looked okay in a three-dimensional design, it would look good as a completed project. And I could remember that it was 33 1/3 inches or whatever it needed to be when I went to make cuts on wood that didn't even exist yet. It's a little bit of branding for my company. So one of the first things that we did was we specified wood species that we wanted to target. I suggested that we might try cherry, and that led to me going on a search for cherry that would work in the dimensions that I needed. Specifically, those big uprights are, I think in the drawing, they're actually 3 3/4 or 3 1/2 sort of dimensional square lumber. And ultimately, they were trimmed down a bit to make it a bit more elegant and not so clunky and blocky looking. But suffice it to say, that did not exist, or it wasn't readily available in any of the markets that I could find. That was a bit thicker and a bit longer than most people were stocking. So I went out to find it myself. And that led me to building my own chainsaw and creating a chainsaw mill. So that's what those slabs were made of, or are made from, is from going out and either harvesting a tree or finding a tree that's been harvested that you can then repurpose. So the most economical way for me to do that, especially since I wasn't planning to have a business of solely milling trees and trying to stick to, creating furniture, I ordered an online giant chainsaw and learned how to assemble a chainsaw from parts. And that's how it turned out. It's sort of a steel replica. It's a giant, like 90 something cc chainsaw. Dwarfs my other normal saw for cutting up trees. And yeah, away we went. I talked to some family and they said, hey, I told them what I was looking for. They said, hey, I think we might have something that you would be interested in. I'm pretty sure that when we put it there, it was a huge cherry tree and we didn't want to burn it for firewood, I think was the case. And it came from a fence line, so it had to be taken down. And it's been there for several years, was that's what all I knew about it. So I went and found the brush pile that the tree was in, and we kind of peeled back the layers, and sure enough, there it was. Everything was right. It was in fact a sizable cherry tree. I would say conservatively that it's 85 years old. I think it's probably more than that, but I never did a ring count on the center. Should have. That was an oversight on my part. But yeah, I set up the this rig here is to take the top cut. The first cut that you make has to be very flat because it's your reference for all the other cuts that you make. So I've made this, and it worked real well. I'd done a few cuts previously, and had already. This wasn't the first time I'd gone out to mill wood, but it paid off because it was an extremely beautiful cherry tree, and was big, and as long as everything worked out and it dried well, would work perfectly for this project. So yeah, there's some more views. Was a rather large tree, and I luckily had some help from my brother and my dad to help muscle around some of these giant slabs. This isn't quite all of them, but these were the main ones, and this is what ultimately got cut into the poles that would become our finished product. So this part of the story of this project is drying. There's a lot of drying that has to go on, especially when you're talking about a 4-inch thick piece of wood. In the industry, they usually say for completely wet wood, which granted this was not completely wet wood, this was a tree that had been down for a while, but had not been cut into slabs. It's 1 inch per year, or 1 year per inch of thickness is the sort of minimum for doing what I was doing, which was to make pole sorts of boards that were they had to be extremely straight, and the tolerances were pretty tight for wood. Anyone who's worked with wood knows that it's is kind of a can be kind of a fickle material and might take on some unexpected characteristics, especially once you start to finish it into a final shape. So this is the wood being cut into sort of very roughly sized, way oversized. In fact, this is still 4 inches, and so these were basically 4x4s or close to it, getting cut out of the slabs. And yeah, this is done in my backyard still. Then it was brought in to dry, and it would dry for a couple of years. So we're going to be going through a few timeline pictures pretty quickly, but there is potentially years in between some of these, or a year in between some of these. So yeah, this is everything inside. And fast forward some time, these have been graded sort of by us. Like, these potentially are some of the best candidates for making this project. They're straight. They didn't take any cracks that we couldn't live with, that we couldn't fix. You'll see a lot of epoxy work here. That's a big part of this, was to use, when we're using this sort of like very wild wood, you get what is in the wood, and sometimes it does develop cracks or might have some little voids, and we could kind of leave those in, but I prefer a smoother project and product, just for aesthetic reasons. But this is after they've been sort of, so we're at this point, we've taken down those big blocky 4x4s and taken them down to something more like 3.5 inches or 3.25 at this point. And we've done a lot of the epoxy work to fill in a lot of the voids. And here's a bit of a close-up on what those voids look like.
What causes them?
So the causes, these voids specifically are caused, and the reason that these show up and why I prefer to keep them, a traditional furniture maker, like if we were making Quaker furniture way back in the day, they would very much try to steer away from these knots and other weird grain patterns and try to stick with things that were straight, so that they got very straight furniture. So I don't do that, because I find that some of the most interesting parts of the wood are like here. You see that there's these are inclusions from branches that grew as the tree grew up, and every year it sort of grows over some of the existing branch, and brings a lot of the interesting grain. The grain of the wood is kind of what becomes the interesting part. The cracks come because especially the round parts of a tree, like a branch, as it's drying, are more likely to crack because they're shrinking as they lose moisture on a circle rather than on a straight line. They're not all one piece there. So when they shrink, if you shrink down something that's circular, it's eventually going to crack, because the pressure from the outside is going to be exceeded, and the inside's still going to be a little bit wet, so it'll break. And that's what caused most of these cracks. In fact, there are also some insect damage from little bugs boring in around the edges and actually going pretty deep into the wood. Of course, all those bugs are long gone at this point, but we did go ahead and fill all of those little holes because it looks nicer, to be honest.
Yeah, and it gives a nice feel. I think it's important that furniture feel nice too, because you're interacting with it more than just looking at it.
Yeah, it's got some filling with epoxy. It's got some, or filling with anything, has real practical benefit of feels nice, and it also, when you wipe it with a cloth, the cloth doesn't catch in it and leave cloth parts behind. Dust doesn't collect in it. There isn't any pet hair or anything like that in it. Like, it's much easier to clean and it stays nicer looking. But I can't say that that's my only reason for doing it. But it does become a very interesting piece, and on the finished piece, it really it's awesome. Yeah, it's good. Um, so over this pretty large time period, I also, while I don't participate in the bonsai hobby, I do appreciate it a lot. I will seek it out if I can find anywhere to check it out, and I checked out some of the best places I think that there is in the United States to see it. Number one being like the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. This one's actually in the Japanese Garden in Portland, Oregon, and the Arboretum, the North Carolina Arboretum near Asheville, is also really awesome. But yeah, so just staying inspired to keep the project in mind. So we've done a lot of drying at this point, and this becomes one of the most nerve-wracking parts, is taking some things that you've got a lot of time invested to, and yeah, you're going to start cutting it up now, and the chances for you ruining it are going to just increase every day now. So yeah, this is me with some green tea and spinning the project a bit more, making sure I know all the angles, because everything's angled in this project. They've all got a 5-degree angle, so the front's angled in 5 degrees, so there isn't a lot of like square, there isn't like a lot of square cutting in this project, which turns out to be a cool project, but isn't maybe the one that you would get from the DIY center at Lowe's or something. And yeah, pulling all the measurements to make sure that I wasn't going to make that wrong cut. So having that project, having the project all in 3D was awesome. And yeah, this is doing some close-ups of what your world looks like for a little while you're doing the joinery and the carpentry. So I prefer Japanese tools for some of the joinery work, so I use Japanese chisels and hammers, and I use this marking knife called a karadashi to mark out all the layout lines before I do the bulk of the removal with another Japanese tool called a Makita router, which is a little bit less peaceful to listen to, but it does some of the bulk of the work first, and then I come in and clean up everything with finer tools. Here's a mess in my shop from doing just that. This is kind of a big point for me because this is the two sides matched together and everything lining up, and actually have like a linoleum floor that has like 3x3 or 4x4 squares, but basically I use it to lay out my projects before I start to cut them, so I can line up everything and make sure everything works on a scale model on my floor, and then as I build the project, I make sure everything's lining up the way it's supposed to, and that all the feet are going to touch the ground, and that all the especially with this is going to get glass eventually, and glass is not forgiving. Like, you can't bend glass a little bit to make it fit. It's got to be pretty much dead on. So yeah, doing some layout there. This was another huge moment in the project. So this is you can see that it's taken on some new design features, and that it has some cross pieces that are they're through tenon type construction, so they hold the piece together really stably. There's no glue or screws or anything in it at this point. It's all held by clamps, and the shelves themselves, the wooden shelves, are what's holding a lot of the structure straight. Rebecca was kind enough to humor me with by getting some detailed pictures of the work. So this is me fitting the shoulders for the cross pieces that are going to be in the front. This is my helper inspecting my work, making sure that it's all straight and flat, and that there's a lot of sawdust for him to sleep in. Some more action shots. A little bit more video when it loads, of sort of the finesse of doing some of the final fitment for a project like this. It kind of happens one ship at a time. And here you can see the what I'll call cross braces, or cross pieces for lack of a correct word. These are the pieces that ultimately go through the big 3x3 pieces, and eventually are going to get a tusk to pull them through and keep everything tight, keep it from racking, because that was the main enemy at this point. And here's how that sort of looks. This is close up, but not finished yet. We're getting close though. This is during another particularly stressful time, which is the glue up. You can see that there are some glue runs and those sorts of things that have happened. And but I'm pretty happy at this point, because everything is solid and where it needs to be, and it all still fits together with the exception of glass. And here's a late night. This is everything trimmed up, and you can see at this point we have fitted the glass, and this was a really exciting moment, because this means that all of the designs worked out. Nothing bent or was not the way that I thought that it would be. Those little attentions to detail have paid off, and we've also got all of the joinery done for the tusks, to do tusk and tenon to pull everything tight. Those are all wedges, and maybe I've got some better pictures of those later. So finishes and wood selection, everything on this piece is cherry, and it's almost all exclusively from the cherry that I harvested. There are a couple of exceptions, and the front cross brace pieces are made from oak, partly because it's really strong and works really well in this sort of an application, and two, because I wanted to draw some contrast to show the joinery that was necessary. I don't want all of my hard work to go unnoticed, so I make some dramatic features by taking some other types of wood and doing an ebonizing process. And ebonizing is a process named for the trying to make something look a bit more like ebony wood, but it's not ebony wood. And in this case, I'm using steel wool dissolved in vinegar, which makes for a chemical called iron acetate, which reacts with the wood, the tannins in the wood specifically, and creates a black finish that polishes out very nicely. And it's mostly for aesthetic reasons, although it does create a nice clean finish as well. And here I'm treating both oak and some walnut pieces, and that's how I got a consistent look, even though there's kind of a few different woods in this project, although primarily, of course, we're dealing with the cherry. It's a slightly out of focus picture, but it does get the point across of the contrasting wood between the walnut, the ebonized walnut, and the otherwise completely all other construction is done in that same harvested cherry. And then you also get some of the glass detail, which is nice.
And you can see how it's held together. It's not screwed, it's put together.
Yeah, so there aren't any screws in this. There's no screws or other metal fasteners except for there are some hidden feet in the bottom in case we would ever need to put this on an unlevel surface. That could be done by adding some screw-in feet. The hardware is there and the recesses are there. I just it went on a nice flat floor, so we didn't need to do that. So I rambled on a bit earlier talking about rays in wood, and these are the sorts of rays that I'm talking about. These are caused by the years and years of pressure, light pressure that's put on a tree when a branch grows out of the side of it. So it's compressing the wood and making these I'm calling them rays in this point, in this instance, and I think that's accurate to say. So, and you can also see there are a few cracks that show through in this, but they are very fine, and most all of them are all filled with the epoxy. But dealing with this sort of work and dealing with the extra cracks, this is why I go through the trouble. Here's some more detail work on this is the oak and how it is a through joint through the cherry, and also has cherry tusks. So I kind of flipped the script on that one and used cherry as my wedge material. And final detail shot, I think, of another of the tusks, and you can also see in the background especially, I really like that foot, the foot of the it's the back one in this picture, but it's actually the front leg when it's installed, and I really like it. Bit of for scale. And seeing the piece fully assembled and the size of it, especially after so much waiting and drying and in my joinery, that it has a presence that's actually pretty amazing, because it's a bigger kind of formidable piece than I would have thought it was before it was a physical object. Like the 3D print or the 3D model didn't quite do justice to it. We use some of our plants, so don't judge us too much for our plant care. But this was kind of to see how the greens and the natural colors were going to work, and get an idea for how this would look used for its purpose that was thought of so long ago. So finally, my brother was kind enough to help me harvest this wood, but he also got this little picture that kind of gets Rebecca was. I thought that this was actually really fast, but Rebecca was teasing me that it was pretty slow. So this is sort of the process of us making those slabs of wood, and the noisy chainsawing and sawmilling and sawdust that we create. So yeah, a little bit slow, I suppose. But I think that is the final slide. Hopefully, touched on everything and didn't bore anyone. Is there anything else that you would?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that I was going to talk about is I liked the theme throughout the project of it's for bonsai, and then it has those shallow angles to sort of reflect Japanese design, and then it's done with Japanese hand tools, even in this case, because of just your preference, but I just think that that's cool.
Yeah, and all of those things, I think, did help contribute to making the project turn out very well, and seeing it finally installed in its home was excellent. So that was a very proud moment for me, and yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now, and yeah, we'll hope to see you soon. And I always enjoy looking in on one of my projects. So
Thanks everybody for letting us do this, and also watching this far if you've made it.
If you made it this far, there will be a prize.